God U, an experiment masking as a university. And being a student at Godolkin University is like living in a constant psychological experiment where the stakes are your soul, your safety, or your future fame. So let's get into it. At God U, your student profile is not about grades, it's about branding. Every choice you make is weighed against whether Vought can market you as the next Starlight or Homelander. Instead of a normal college stresses of majors, job prospects, you're under the microscope of marketability. And that pressure twists your identity into a product. So you're not just studying, you're constantly auditioning. And, this is all about paranoia working against that competition level. God U is a gladiator pit in varsity jackets. Everyone is competing for the top 10 spots in the ranking. That means every friendship is conditional, every romance is political, and every betrayal is baked into the culture. Students live in paranoia. Anyone could sabotage you, leak your secrets, or even kill you to climb the ladder. And the psychological toll is extreme. You're forced to constantly question who's real and who's just being opportunistic. And there's a level of moral corruption. Being young and superpowered means you're constantly exposed to extremes. Sex, drugs, violence. But with corporate sponsorship is what's going on here. You're taught not to ask, is this right? But how does this play on social media? And this corrodes empathy. It creates a warped moral compass. Students are encouraged to be both predators and performers, which erodes the boundary between authentic human experience and manufactured spectacle. And they live in this constant fear of being irrelevant. Unlike a regular student who drops out, a God U student fears being forgotten. Irrelevance is a fate worse than death because you're raised to believe Compound V made you special. And the idea of being ordinary for any of these people just gnaws at them constantly. If you don't break through into the 7, you become a washed up sidekick or worse, a suit for hire working at mall openings. And there's all this trauma and disassociation. Every student carries a different trauma on how they got their powers or their powers manifested, how their parents raised them to be a project. And God U isn't a place about healing, it's a pressure cooker. Students cope with self-harm, addictions, and complete detachment from humanity. This association becomes survival. Pretend you're fine even if you're bleeding inside. So in short, man, God U feels like, college plus the Hunger Games plus reality TV, all run by a corporation with zero ethics. A place where your powers are less about saving lives and more about securing sponsorship deals. And a campus where everybody smiles for the cameras, but silently calculates whether you're stepping on a stone or walking to a threat. Like it's constant pressure to school. And above all places, this is one place I would not want to go during my college years.